Hey guys, welcome back to Sleep into Power. I am NJ, and tonight we are going to drift a very long way from wherever you happen to be lying right now. Further than usual, further than most nights. We are going back more than 3,000 years, to a stretch of dark water at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, and to a world that once believed itself permanent. Somewhere out there, beyond the last lamps of the harbor, there are ships. Nobody quite knows whose they are. They are not the ships of the great kings, because the great kings send word ahead, and their vessels arrive with scribes and seals and long lists of gifts. These ships arrive without announcement. They appear at the edge of the horizon in the gray hour before the coastline resolves into detail, and by the time anyone on shore is certain of what they are seeing, it is already a little too late to do very much about it. That is the image I would like you to hold as you settle tonight. Dark water. A low, warm wind coming off the sea. A coastline of stone-built towns and painted palaces and grain stores and temples. All of it linked by roads and trade routes and letters, carried in the hands of messengers. All of it functioning. All of it quietly certain that tomorrow will look very much like today. And out beyond it, at the furthest visible line, where the water stops being water and becomes only distance, something moving that nobody expected. They are called the Sea Peoples. That name is one of the strangest and most misleading in all of ancient history, and part of what we are going to do tonight is take it apart very gently and look at what is actually inside it. Because the truth is that no one in the Bronze Age ever called themselves a sea person. It is a modern label, invented in the 19th century, thrown like a net over a handful of names that appear on Egyptian temple walls, and it has held those names together ever since, sometimes usefully, and sometimes in ways that hide far more than they reveal. Tonight we are going to travel into the final decades of the late Bronze Age, into the years around 1200 BCE, when a world of interconnected kingdoms, Egypt, the Hittite Empire, the palaces of Mycenaean Greece, the wealthy harbor cities of the Levant, the copper island of Cyprus, the towns of Canaan, and the extraordinary trading city of Ugarit, came apart with a speed that still unsettles the people who study it. Palaces burned, trade routes emptied, whole writing systems fell out of use. Cities that had stood for centuries were abandoned so completely that grass grew over them and nobody came back. And in the middle of that ruin, in the surviving inscriptions of the pharaohs, there are these people from the sea, raiders or refugees, invaders or migrants, destroyers of the ancient world, or simply the most visible symptom of a collapse that had already begun long before their sails appeared. That is our question for tonight, and I want to be honest with you at the very start. I am not going to be able to answer it completely, because nobody can. What I can do is walk you slowly through the evidence, the theories, the ruins and the letters, and let you feel what it might have been like to be alive in a world that was ending, and to be one of the people who kept moving through it. So there is nothing to work out tonight, nothing to remember. You can let your body go heavy exactly where it is. Let the weight of the day settle out of your shoulders, and your jaw, and your hands, and let my voice do all the traveling. Before we begin properly, just a few short things, and then I will not interrupt you again. If tonight's journey resonates with you, and you would like something to take further into your own life, I have written a book called Sleep into Power, the nightly guide to reprogramming your mind for wealth, success, and inner peace. It is a deeper exploration of the ideas underneath this channel, how sleep, imagination, identity, and the quiet psychology of the hours before rest can be used to build lasting inner change, along with the practical nightly habits that make that change hold. It is available in paperback and on Kindle, and you can find it through the link in the description. Sleep into Power is also on Spotify, so if you prefer listening there, or if you would like to take these documentaries and these nighttime journeys with you, on a train, during a flight, or in a hotel room in a city you do not know, you will find the whole catalog waiting for you. If you value what happens on this channel, and you would like to support the making of these long-form documentaries, there is a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description as well. It is entirely optional, and nothing here ever sits behind it. Listening is more than enough. And if you would like something gentler and more inward than history, I have a second channel called Meditate into Power. It is where I put the guided meditations and the practical inner work, relaxation, confidence, subconscious transformation, personal growth, and the slow business of developing real personal power. The link for that is in the description too. That is everything. No more interruptions. Now let the room around you get a little quieter. Let the modern world, the notifications, the deadlines, the small unfinished conversations of the day begin to move away from you, the way a shoreline moves away from a boat that has slipped its mooring in the dark. Because we are going back now, past the last century and the one before it, past the age of steam and the age of sail, past the cathedrals and the plagues and the long silence of the medieval world, past Rome with its aqueducts and its legions and its certainty that it would last forever, past Athens and its philosophers, past the Persian kings and their roads, past even the poets who first sang of Troy, because by the time anyone sings of Troy, the world we are traveling to has already been gone for 400 years, and survives only as a rumor of something enormous that used to exist. Keep going back beyond the first alphabets, back beyond iron, back into an age of bronze and clay and painted plaster, of chariots and cedar ships, and letters pressed into wet tablets with a sharpened reed. And there, around the year 1300 BCE, the traveling stops, and the world opens up in front of you. It is warmer than you expected. The light is very clear. You are standing on a stone quay in a harbor, on the coast of what we would now call Syria, and the sea in front of you is the color of ink and turquoise, where the sun cuts into it. There are ships tied up along the whole length of the water, broad-bellied merchant vessels with a single square sail furled against the yard, their hulls dark with pitch, riding low because they are heavy with cargo. Behind you the town rises up the slope in tiers of flat-roofed houses, and above them all sits the palace, a vast complex of courtyards and storerooms and archive rooms, its outer walls thick enough to take a battering ram, its inner rooms cool and shadowed, and smelling faintly of oil and cedar and dust. This is Ugarit, and in this moment it is one of the richest places on earth. Remember it as it is now, because we will come back to it later, and it will not look like this. Walk with me for a moment along the quay. This is the best way I know to explain what the Late Bronze Age actually was, because it was not really a collection of separate countries the way we picture the ancient world. It was a system, a single, enormous, interlocking system stretched across the eastern Mediterranean and deep into the Near East, and it had taken something like 300 years to build. Look at what is being unloaded. There are copper ingots, cast in a shape that archaeologists would later call oxhide, because each one is a flattened rectangle with 4 handle-like corners, like a stretched animal skin. Each weighs somewhere in the region of 30 kilograms, a load for a strong man to carry on his shoulder. That copper has come from Cyprus, an island close enough to see from the right hilltop on a clear day, and Cyprus in this period is producing copper on an industrial scale, sending it out across the sea in quantities that speak of quotas and contracts and long-standing arrangements between kings. Beside the copper there are smaller ingots of tin, and the tin is the interesting part. Tin is what makes bronze possible. Copper on its own is soft and disappointing, but add roughly 1 part tin to 9 parts copper and you get a metal hard enough for a sword blade, a plow tip, a chisel, an axe, an arrowhead, a razor, a mirror. Bronze is the material this entire age is named after, and the whole of its civilization, its armies, its farms, its craftsmen, its wealth, rests upon the marriage of those two metals. But tin is rare. There is almost none of it in the eastern Mediterranean. The tin arriving in this harbor has traveled an extraordinary distance to get here, most probably overland from sources far to the east, through the mountains and across the trade roads of Mesopotamia, passing through the hands of merchant after merchant, city after city, tariff after tariff, before it ever reaches the sea. Some historians think a portion of it came from as far away as Central Asia, and there are ongoing arguments about routes and sources that may never be entirely resolved. Think about what that means. The most important strategic material in the Bronze Age world, the substance without which there are no weapons and no tools, cannot be produced locally by almost anyone who needs it. It has to be imported from very far away, along routes that pass through the territory of a great many other people, every one of whom has to be either paid, placated, or in some way kept friendly. That is not a weakness anyone in this harbor would recognize as a weakness. On a bright morning like this one, with the ships coming in and the ingots stacked on the quayside, it looks like the opposite. It looks like reach. It looks like a world that has solved the problem of distance. And it had, in a way. That is what makes this period so remarkable, and what makes what happens next so difficult to look away from. Because the goods coming off these ships are not only raw metals. There is Canaanite pottery, filled with olive oil and resinous wine. There are jars of terebinth resin, burned as incense in temples from the Nile to the Aegean. There is ebony and ivory from Africa, glass ingots of deep cobalt blue, ostrich eggshells, faience beads, gold from Egyptian mines, silver from Anatolia, amber that has somehow made its way down from the Baltic, and finely painted stirrup jars from the Greek mainland, from the palace kingdoms we now call Mycenaean, carrying perfumed oil that people in the Levant have developed a taste for. We know this cargo so precisely because of an accident. Sometime in the late 14th century BCE, a merchant ship went down off the southern coast of Anatolia, near a headland called Uluburun, and it stayed on the seabed, largely undisturbed, for more than 3,000 years. When divers found it and archaeologists worked through it, they recovered 10 tons of copper, close to a ton of tin, and a startling variety of goods and personal possessions from what appears to be almost every corner of this world at once. One ship, one voyage. And on board, materials and objects from Cyprus, Egypt, Canaan, Mycenaean Greece, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and beyond. That wreck is the single clearest window we have into how thoroughly connected this age had become. It is a small wooden vessel carrying an entire international economy in its hold, and it sank, and the sea kept it for us. Stand on the quay a moment longer and let that settle. Everything you can see here, the wealth, the artistry, the food in the storerooms, the tools in the workshops, the bronze on the hip of the man walking past you, depends on ships like that one arriving safely, again and again and again, year after year, from places most of the people in this town will never see. Now leave the harbor and walk up into the town. The streets are narrow and shadowed, and the walls hold the heat. There are workshops with their shutters open, a bronze smith working a blade, a potter's wheel turning, a dyer's yard where the smell is so overpowering that the whole quarter has learned to live downwind of it, because this coast produces a purple dye from sea snails that is worth more by weight than most of the metal in the harbor. And up at the top, in the palace, there is a room that matters more than any of the others. It is an archive. Shelves of clay tablets, stacked and sorted, each one baked hard or dried in the sun, each one covered in the small wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform, letters, inventories, contracts, legal rulings, tax records, diplomatic correspondence, ration lists, receipts for grain and oil and cloth. This is the nervous system of the Bronze Age. Not the swords, not the chariots, the tablets. Because the thing that holds this world together is not primarily force, it is administration. It is the ability of a small number of literate men sitting in cool rooms in a handful of palaces to keep track of who owes what to whom across a distance of 1,000 miles. The scribes here are unusual even by the standards of their age. They write in several languages and several scripts because Ugarit sits at a crossroads and its business is with everyone. There is Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the entire Near East, the Latin of its day. A king in Egypt writing to a king in Anatolia will very often write in Akkadian, even though it is the mother tongue of neither of them. There is Hurrian and Hittite and Egyptian and Cypro-Minoan, and there is a local script, a remarkable thing, a cuneiform alphabet of around 30 signs, one of the earliest alphabetic systems anyone anywhere had devised. An attempt, you might say, to make writing simpler and faster and less the private property of a lifelong professional class. We will come back to that thought later, because it turns out to matter. Now, the letters themselves. This is where the late Bronze Age becomes something closer to a family drama than a history lesson. Because the great kings of this world knew each other, not as abstractions, not as distant rival powers, but personally, by name, through decades of correspondence. The Pharaoh of Egypt, the king of the Hittites in the Anatolian highlands, the king of Assyria, the king of Babylon, the king of Mitanni, while Mitanni still stood, the ruler of Elashia on Cyprus. These men wrote to one another constantly, and a large body of that correspondence survives, most famously in a cache of tablets found at Amarna in Egypt. And the tone of those letters is extraordinary. They call each other brother, they ask after each other's health, and the health of each other's wives and horses and households. They arrange marriages between their families. They send gifts, gold, lapis lazuli, horses, chariots, furniture, textiles, physicians, sculptors, and then they complain, at length and with real feeling, about the gifts they have received in return. There is a rhythm to it that anyone who has ever had a difficult relative would recognize immediately. My brother, you say you love me, and yet the gold you sent was less than you promised, and some of it was not even good gold. My brother, your messenger has been kept waiting at my court for 2 years, and this is not how brothers behave. My brother, I have sent you what you asked for, and now I would like you to remember that I asked you for something also. Beneath the courtesy there is constant calculation. These are not friendships. They are the working relationships of men who each control an enormous amount of what the others need, and who have all quietly concluded that trade and marriage are cheaper than war, most of the time. Not always. In around 1274 BCE, at a place called Kadesh on the Orontes River, the Egyptian army under Ramesses II met the Hittite army under Muwatalli II in what may have been the largest chariot battle ever fought. Both sides claimed victory. Ramesses had the account carved onto temple walls up and down Egypt in enormous detail, with himself at the center of it, alone and heroic and abandoned by his own troops, personally turning the tide. We should hold on to that, because it is the first quiet lesson of tonight's story. When a pharaoh puts something on a wall, he is not writing history. He is making a claim. And in Egyptian royal art, the pharaoh always wins, because the pharaoh winning is not a fact being reported, but a principle being maintained. The principle that order holds, that chaos is pushed back at the borders, that the world is being kept in its proper shape by the man the gods put there to keep it. Keep that in mind. It will matter enormously when we reach the Sea Peoples, because almost everything we know about them comes from exactly that kind of wall. What happened after Kadesh is in some ways more revealing than the battle. The two empires eventually signed a treaty. Copies survive from both sides, one in Egypt, one in the Hittite capital. A formal peace, with mutual defense clauses and provisions for the return of fugitives. And then, some years later, Ramesses married a Hittite princess, and the correspondence between the two courts settled into something almost domestic. That is the world we are in. Two superpowers who had fought each other to a standstill, deciding, in effect, that the system was worth more than the quarrel. Now let me show you what that system actually rested on, because this is the part that people usually skip, and it is the part that explains everything that follows. Walk down from the archive room into the storerooms below. They are enormous, rows of great ceramic jars, some of them taller than a man, sunk into the floor for stability. Grain in some, olive oil in others, wine, dried fish, wool, finished cloth, folded and stacked. This is a palace economy, and it works in a way that is genuinely difficult for a modern mind to hold, because it is not a market. There is trade, certainly, and there are merchants, and some of them are wealthy men operating with a good deal of independence. But the core of the system runs through the palace. The farmers in the surrounding countryside hand over a share of what they grow. It comes into these storerooms. It is counted, recorded, and stored. And then it is given back out, as rations to the craftsmen who work for the palace, to the scribes, to the soldiers, to the rowers, to the priests, to the people who build and repair and cook and carry. The palace collects, and the palace distributes, and the tablets in the room above are the record of every movement in and out. Which means the palace is not simply the government. It is the granary, the bank, the treasury, the archive, the arms depot, the workshop, the temple's landlord, and the employer of a substantial part of the population. It is the thing that turns a scattered set of villages into a state. And it means something else, something that in good years nobody has any reason to think about. If the palace goes, everything goes with it. Not just the king. The record of who owns what. The system that decides who eats. The mechanism that gets copper to the smiths, and grain to the rowers, and oil to the temples. The literacy itself in many cases, because in a world where writing is a professional skill maintained by a small number of trained men working for the palace, the destruction of the palace can mean the end of writing in that region altogether. Not a decline, not a simplification, but a stop. That is what makes this civilization both magnificent and strangely brittle. It has achieved something remarkable. It has taken specialized, complicated, interdependent activity and organized it across enormous distances. But every layer of that achievement is a layer of dependence. The smith depends on the tin depends on the root depends on the treaty depends on the king depends on the harvest depends on the rain, and each of those dependencies is invisible until the moment it fails. There is something in this that goes far beyond the Bronze Age, and I will only touch it lightly here and then leave it alone, because it will come back on its own. Complexity is a form of strength. It is what allows a society to do things that a simpler society cannot. To build in stone, to write, to specialize, to feed people who do not farm, to make objects of real beauty, to keep records that outlive the men who wrote them. Nobody chooses complexity as a mistake. It is chosen again and again, because at every step it solves a real problem. But complexity is also a form of debt. Every connection that makes the system stronger is also a connection through which failure can travel. And the more successful the system becomes, the more of that hidden debt it accumulates, and the more confidently everyone inside it assumes that the arrangement is simply how the world is, rather than something built by particular people at a particular time that could, in principle, come apart. The men in this palace do not think of themselves as living in a fragile world. Why would they? Their grandfathers traded with Cyprus. Their great-grandfathers traded with Cyprus. The ships have always come. The pharaoh has always been in Egypt, and the great king has always been in Hattusa, and the letters have always gone back and forth, and the copper has always arrived. Systems of this kind tend to look most permanent shortly before they are not. So let us leave Ugarit for now. The harbor, the dye yards, the tablets on their shelves, and let us go up onto the high plateau, north and inland, to see the other great power of this age, because the Hittites are not like the Egyptians at all, and their situation is about to become very important. Feel the air change as we climb. The coast falls away behind us, and the land rises into a vast Anatolian plateau, dry and stony and open, cold in winter, hot and dusty in summer, with mountain ranges standing along the horizon like a distant wall. Hattusa sits up here, and it is a strange and magnificent place, a capital built into rock, with walls running for kilometers over ridges and gorges, and gateways carved with lions and sphinxes, and a warrior god striding out of the stone. Beneath the city there are tunnels cut through the bedrock. Above it, temples, and in the upper city, another archive, thousands of tablets, the working memory of an empire that at its height controlled Anatolia and reached down into Syria. The Hittites are the great land power of this world. Their army is built around the chariot, and their state around a warrior aristocracy, and a nervous, quarrelsome royal family, whose succession disputes run like a fault line through their entire history. Sons rebel against fathers, brothers depose brothers. Regional governors, often royal relatives, sit in cities far from the capital, with armies of their own and reasons of their own. And there is one more thing about the Hittite Empire that will matter more than any of it. Anatolia is not naturally a rich agricultural country. The plateau is high and dry, and the margin between a good harvest and a bad one is thinner than it is on the Nile or in the river valleys of Mesopotamia. For much of its history, the empire manages because it controls enough territory to move surplus from one region to another. But by the last decades of the 13th century BCE, something has begun to go wrong with the food. We know this because of the letters. There is a body of correspondence scattered across several archives in which Hittite kings and their officials write about grain with an urgency that does not appear in earlier centuries. Ships are to be loaded and sent. A cargo is described as a matter of life or death. An Egyptian ruler is recorded as sending grain to the land of the Hittites. Orders are given for barley to be moved to particular ports and forwarded on. In one letter, a queen writes about the absence of grain in her land, in terms that leave very little room for interpretation. Now, historians argue about how to read this. Ancient rulers exaggerate. A request for emergency supplies can be a diplomatic maneuver as easily as a genuine cry for help, and the language of crisis is a useful thing to have in your mouth when you are asking a foreign king for something expensive. It is entirely possible that some of these letters describe a local shortfall rather than a general disaster, but there is a great deal of it, from more than one place, over a sustained period, and it points in one direction. In the final decades of the Bronze Age, the Hittite Empire is having serious and repeated trouble feeding itself, and it is importing food by sea from Egypt and the Levant to make up the difference. And that is where the second body of evidence comes in, which is not written by anyone at all. Over the last several decades, scientists have gone looking for the climate of this period, in the places where climate leaves its own records. Pollen preserved in the sediment at the bottom of lakes and in the Sea of Galilee. Mineral layers in cave formations. Sediment cores from the Nile Delta and from the sea floor. Isotope ratios that carry a signature of how much rain fell and when. The picture that has emerged from a number of these studies, and I want to be careful here, because the field is active and the results are debated and refined continually, is of a shift towards drier conditions in the eastern Mediterranean, beginning somewhere in the late 13th century BCE, and continuing, with variation, for a long time afterwards. In several of the studies, the change is not a single bad year, but a prolonged period of reduced rainfall, lasting decades, possibly longer. Not a biblical drought, not a desert swallowing the world. Something more ordinary and, in its way, far more dangerous. A run of years in which the rain came less reliably, the harvests came in lighter, and the margin that every agricultural society depends on quietly disappeared. We should be honest about the limits of this. Establishing precise dates from environmental data is extremely difficult, and matching a climate signal to a historical event is harder still. Some scholars think the drought evidence has been leaned on too heavily, that the correlation is looser than it appears, that regional variation matters more than any single overall trend. Others think it is close to the center of the whole story. The debate is genuinely open. But hold the two things together for a moment, the letters and the sediment, and consider what they would mean on the ground. We might imagine a village on the Anatolian plateau in a year when the spring rain does not really arrive. Not a catastrophe. The first year is never a catastrophe. The barley comes in thin, and people eat a little less, and the stored surplus from previous years covers the gap. And everyone says that next year will be better, because next year usually is. The second year is thinner again. Now the stores are low, and the seed grain, the portion that must be held back and not eaten, because it is next year's crop, starts to look, to a hungry family, less like a sacred obligation and more like food sitting in a jar. By the third or fourth year, the arithmetic has changed permanently. There is less to hand over to the palace, so the palace has less to give out. The rations for the craftsmen shrink. The rations for the soldiers shrink. Prices rise, if there is any market at all, and the wealthy buy while the poor do not. The palace, which exists precisely to smooth out bad years, is being asked to smooth out a bad decade, and it cannot. And then people move. That is what people do. It is the oldest and most reliable response in human history to a place that will no longer feed you. You leave it and go somewhere that will. Not as an army, as families, in small groups, then larger ones, along the roads and the coasts, carrying what can be carried, looking for a town with grain in it, or a lord who needs soldiers, or a coast with fish, or simply somewhere the rain still falls. Hold on to that image of movement, because we are going to need it much later, when we start asking who exactly the sea peoples were. Now, there is a third pressure, and it is the most dramatic and the most contested of all. Across the eastern Mediterranean, in this same window of time, a number of major sites show evidence of earthquake damage. Collapsed walls that have fallen in a single direction, skeletons found beneath rubble, structural repairs, distinctive patterns of destruction that engineers and archaeologists associate with seismic activity rather than fire or war. This region sits along active fault systems, and earthquakes are simply part of life there. But some researchers have argued that the period around 1225 to 1175 BCE saw an unusual concentration of them, the idea sometimes called an earthquake storm, in which stress released along one section of a fault transfers to the next section, which fails in turn, producing a sequence of major earthquakes over a period of decades along a connected fault system. It is a real seismological phenomenon, and it has been proposed for this period with some seriousness. It has also been criticized, on the grounds that the dating of ancient destruction layers is rarely precise enough to establish a sequence, and that it is easy to see a pattern in a scatter of damage spread over half a century and several hundred miles. So we cannot say with confidence that a chain of earthquakes brought down the Bronze Age. What we can reasonably say is that some of these cities were hit by earthquakes at some point in their final decades, and that an earthquake is an expensive thing to happen to a society that is already short of food, short of labor, and short of the imported materials it needs to rebuild. And now consider a fourth thing, which is the least visible in the archaeological record, and possibly the most corrosive. People inside the system were fighting each other. The Hittite royal family, as I mentioned, had a chronic problem with succession. In the empire's final generations, there were rival branches of the dynasty, and a breakaway kingdom in the east under a related line, and vassal states in the west that rebelled repeatedly and had to be brought back into line by force again and again. Assyria was rising in the east and pressing hard on Hittite territory. There was, at various points, an effort to blockade or restrict trade between rival powers. Egypt had its own troubles. The long reign of Ramesses II was followed by a series of shorter, more contested ones, with disputes over the succession, at least one usurpation, and periods in which central authority was clearly under strain. Documents from the workers' village at Deir el-Medina record something remarkable in this general era. Laborers who built the royal tombs downing tools and refusing to work because their rations had not been delivered. One of the earliest recorded strikes in human history, and its cause is a supply failure. None of these things, taken alone, is enough to end a civilization. Empires survive droughts. They survive earthquakes and rebellions and disputed successions. They survive piracy and border wars. They have survived all of them before. The question that has occupied historians for a century is what happens when they all arrive together, in a system that is more tightly interconnected than any that has previously existed. And this is where the idea of cascading failure becomes useful. Picture the whole Bronze Age world as a web. Every strand is a relationship, a trade route, a treaty, a marriage, a tribute obligation, a shipping lane, a supply of grain or copper or tin. In a strong web, the loss of a single strand is absorbed. The load redistributes. Nothing much happens. But if the web is already under tension, then each strand that goes puts more strain on the ones still holding. So drought reduces harvests, which reduces the surplus the palaces control, which reduces what they can trade and what they can pay their soldiers and rowers with. Reduced trade means fewer ships, which means more risk on the routes that remain, which raises the cost of everything moving by sea. Hungry people leave home and move along the coasts, and some of them, having nothing, take to raiding. And raiding makes the sea routes more dangerous still, which reduces trade further, which starves the palaces of revenue, which weakens their ability to police the coast, which makes raiding easier. Meanwhile, a city hit by an earthquake needs timber and metal and labor to rebuild, at exactly the moment when timber and metal and labor have become harder to obtain. A vassal king in a distant province notices that the imperial army has not come to help him for some time, and begins to wonder whether it can. A great king, short of grain, presses harder on his subjects, who resent it, and some of whom leave. Each of these is a small, local, unremarkable event. Together, they form a loop, and the loop turns in one direction only. That is what a systems collapse looks like from the inside. Not a single catastrophe with a name and a date, but a slow accumulation of ordinary difficulties in a structure that has quietly lost its ability to absorb them. And in the middle of that, on the sea, something begins to happen that the palaces do not have a good answer for, because there had always been raiders. That is worth saying clearly, because it changes how we should read what comes next. Piracy in the Eastern Mediterranean was not an innovation of the 12th century. It was a permanent feature of coastal life. There are letters from centuries earlier complaining about ships taken and coastal towns robbed. There is a people called the Luca, associated with the southwestern coast of Anatolia, the region later known as Lycia, who appear in the records repeatedly as a nuisance, raiding by sea, seizing cargoes, occasionally being complained about by kings who cannot control them. There is a letter, preserved in Egypt, in which the ruler of Alashiya on Cyprus responds to an Egyptian complaint about Lucca raiders by saying, in effect, that these people are not his, and he does not control them. So raiding is normal, small-scale, opportunistic, endemic. Attacks on coastal life, no more the end of a civilization than highway robbery was the end of the 18th century. What appears to change, in the closing decades of the Bronze Age, is the scale. And to see that change, we have to go to Egypt, because Egypt is where the writing survives. Let the plateau fall away behind you. Let the cold stone of Hattusa go, and come south and west, down to a river valley cut through desert, where the land is green for a few miles on either side of the water, and then simply stops, and beyond it there is nothing but sand and rock and heat. Egypt in this period is old. That is the first thing to understand about it. The pyramids at Giza are already something like 14 centuries old when the Sea Peoples appear, a gap wider than the one that separates us from the earliest medieval cathedrals, and far enough that Egyptians of this era looked at those monuments with a sense of inheriting something built by people who were not quite like them. And Egypt has an idea at the center of its civilization that is going to shape everything we are about to read. The Egyptians called it Matat, order, balance, truth, the correct arrangement of things. Matat is what the gods established and what the pharaoh exists to maintain. Against it stands Isfet, chaos, disorder, the formless. The pharaoh's role is to hold the line between them, which means that in Egyptian royal art, foreigners are not simply foreigners. They are the visible face of disorder. They are shown bound, kneeling, trodden underfoot, gripped by the hair, arranged in neat rows beneath the pharaoh's chariot. It is not a claim about any particular battle. It is a statement about how the universe is organized. So when we go now to read the Egyptian accounts of the Sea Peoples, which are, let me be clear, the main written source we have for their existence at all, we are not reading a report. We are reading a monument. It may well contain accurate information. It is not trying primarily to convey accurate information. Hold that lightly and let us look. The first substantial appearance comes in the reign of Merneptah, a son of Ramesses II, who came to the throne as an elderly man around 1213 BCE. In the 5th year of his reign, Egypt faced an invasion of the western delta by Libyan tribes under a chief named Merieh. And in the Egyptian account of that campaign, the Libyans are not alone. They have allies with them, foreign peoples, described as coming from the sea or from northern lands. The names, as they are rendered in Egyptian, include the Ekwesh, the Teresh, the Luka, the Sherdan, and the Shekelesh. That is the first time this cluster of names appears together in a way that has made modern historians reach for a single collective term. A few things are worth noticing about it straight away. They are fighting alongside Libyans, on land, in the western delta, not arriving from the sea in a great fleet. The Egyptian text describes them as allies or supporters of the Libyan chief, and there is a suggestion that some had settled in Libyan territory beforehand. Whatever these groups were, in this instance they were part of somebody else's war. The Egyptian account records enormous casualties and a complete victory, along with quantities of plunder and prisoners. Whether the numbers are reliable is another matter entirely. Egyptian battle figures generally are not. And in the same reign, on a separate monument, the stele that has become famous for containing the earliest known reference to a people called Israel, Merneptah declares peace restored, enemies subdued, order re-established. It is a summary of triumph, and its purpose is theological as much as military. So already, at the very first appearance, we have a complication. These people from the sea are not attacking Egypt out of nowhere as a unified force. They are appearing as one element in a coalition, in a border war, at a moment when Egypt is already fighting a Libyan population that appears itself to be under pressure and looking for land in the delta. Then, roughly 30 years later, we reach the account that has defined the sea peoples in the modern imagination. Ramesses III came to the throne around 1184 BCE, the second pharaoh of a new dynasty, in a period of instability. He built an enormous mortuary temple on the west bank at Thebes, at a place now called Medinet Habu, and its walls carry the fullest surviving account of a conflict with these peoples. The text describes his 8th year, and it describes something quite different from a border raid. It speaks of a movement of foreign lands, of a conspiracy or league among them, of no land being able to stand before their arms. It lists the great powers of the north as having been swept away: the Hittite lands, Carchemish, Arsawa, Alashia. It describes a camp established in the land of Amuru, on the Syrian coast, and a force advancing towards Egypt. And it names them: the Peliset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh. Then it describes how Ramesses prepared: the Nile mouths fortified and held like a wall, a line of warships and small craft stationed at the river outlets, the shore lined with troops and archers. And it describes the battle, a fight in the delta, ships grappled and overturned, the invaders caught between the vessels on the water and the archers on the bank. Alongside the text, there are the reliefs. I want to describe these carefully, because they are the closest thing we have to seeing these people, and because what they show is genuinely haunting. There is a naval battle. The Egyptian ships have oars, and the enemy ships do not appear to. Their vessels are shown with sails, with high curving prows and sterns, sometimes ending in birds' heads. Men fall into the water. Ships are shown tilted, capsizing. Egyptian archers shoot from their decks and from the shore. The composition is deliberately chaotic on the enemy side, and deliberately ordered on the Egyptian side. The warriors are drawn with distinctive equipment, and the details are consistent enough that they clearly meant something to the artists. Some wear a tall headdress that appears as a crest of vertical elements above a headband, usually described as a feathered headdress, though whether it was actually feathers, reeds, stiffened hair, or leather is not known. Others wear horned helmets, sometimes with a disc between the horns. They carry round shields, straight swords, spears. Some have short kilts with tassels. And then, in one of the land battle scenes, there is something that changes the whole meaning of the wall. There are ox carts, solid-wheeled carts drawn by oxen, and in them, women and children. They are shown in the middle of the fighting, carts overturning, an Egyptian soldier reaching towards them. Whatever else this was, it was not simply a raiding fleet. Somebody brought their family. That single detail has done more to shape modern thinking about the sea peoples than any other image from the ancient world. Raiders do not travel with children in wagons. Armies do not, generally, bring the household. People move like that when they are not going back. Now, we have to be careful even here. Egyptian artists worked with conventions and with a symbolic vocabulary, and the presence of families in a battle scene can be read as a way of showing total defeat. The enemy destroyed root and branch, not merely repulsed. Some scholars have suggested that the land battle and the sea battle at Medinet Habu may not represent two phases of a single campaign, so much as a composite image of victory. There are also arguments about whether the events of the 8th year were quite as vast as the text claims, or whether a real but more limited engagement has been inflated into a cosmic confrontation between order and chaos. That last point deserves a moment, because it is easy to miss how strange the Medinet Habu account is. The text does not describe a war between Egypt and a foreign kingdom. It describes the arrival of something almost elemental: nations moving, lands scattered in a moment, no country able to stand. And against that, the pharaoh, alone, immovable, holding the mouths of the Nile like a wall of bronze. That is a myth. It is also, possibly, a fairly accurate description of what it felt like from inside Egypt in the 1170s BCE. Because if the news reaching the Nile Valley in those years included the fall of Hattusa, the burning of Ugarit, the collapse of the Syrian coast, and the arrival of displaced armed populations on the border, then the idea that the world beyond the frontier had simply come apart would not have seemed like an exaggeration at all. It would have seemed like the plain truth. Something else is worth pausing on, because it complicates the story of invasion in a way that many popular accounts skip over entirely. The Shurden. They appear in the Merneptah account as enemies, but they appear elsewhere, earlier, as something quite different. In the reign of Ramesses II, Shurden warriors are recorded as having been defeated and captured, and then incorporated into the Egyptian army. At the Battle of Kadesh, Shurden troops with horned helmets and round shields are depicted fighting on the Egyptian side, as part of the pharaoh's own guard. So one of the groups later listed among the Sea Peoples was, decades before, serving as elite Egyptian soldiers. And after the wars of Ramesses III, there is evidence that captured enemies were settled in Egypt and in Egyptian-controlled territory, given land, and used as garrison troops. Enemy, mercenary, prisoner, settler, soldier. The same name occupying every one of those positions within a couple of generations. That is one of the most important facts in this entire subject, and it should make us permanently suspicious of any account, ancient or modern, that treats these people as a fixed thing with a fixed intention. Now let us look at those names properly, because the names are where the deepest arguments live. There are 9 that recur across the Egyptian inscriptions: the Shurden, the Shekelesh, the Luka, the Ekwesh, the Teresh, the Peleset, the Cheka, the Denyen, and the Weshesh. Different texts list different combinations. No single text lists all of them together. And before we go any further, an important technical point that shapes everything else. Egyptian writing did not record vowels. What survives is a consonantal skeleton, and the vowel sounds we insert when we say these names aloud are modern conventions, best guesses, or simply habits inherited from 19th century scholarship. When I say Shekelesh, or Peleset, or Weshesh, I am pronouncing a reconstruction. The people who bore those names may have said them very differently, and may not have used them for themselves at all, since these are Egyptian renderings of foreign words, filtered through a foreign writing system and a foreign ear. Bear that in mind as we go, because a great deal of the theorizing about who these people were rests on the resemblance between one name and another, and resemblance, when the vowels are missing and the transcription is uncertain, is a very slippery thing to build on. Still, let us walk through them, gently, one at a time, and see what has been suggested. The Shurden are usually the first name anyone reaches for, because of a similarity that has been noticed since the earliest days of Egyptology. Shurden, Sardinia. It is an old proposal, and it remains one of the more discussed ones. Bronze Age Sardinia had a striking culture of its own, built around the stone towers called nuraghi, and it produced bronze figurines of warriors, some of them with horned helmets and round shields, not entirely unlike the Shurden of the Egyptian reliefs, though those figurines are generally later in date than the reliefs, which complicates the comparison considerably. The difficulty is direction. Did Shurden come from Sardinia to the east, or did some group called Shurden end up in Sardinia and give the island its name? Or is the resemblance simply a resemblance? There is genuine Bronze Age contact between the central and eastern Mediterranean. Mycenaean pottery has been found in Sardinia, and there is evidence of metal moving in both directions, so contact is real. What it means for the origin of a people named on an Egyptian wall is far less clear. The Shekelesh have been linked on similar grounds to Sicily, and to the people the Greeks later called the Sicels. The same objections apply, in the same order. The Teresh have been connected to the Teresinoi, a name later associated with the Etruscans of Italy. That proposal has a long history and some enthusiastic supporters, but it depends on a chain of associations across many centuries, and modern work on Etruscan origins has complicated the picture rather than settling it. The Luca are on firmer ground because they are not only a sea people's name, they appear in Hittite records for centuries as a troublesome region in southwestern Anatolia, and the identification with the later Lycia is widely accepted. These are people who existed in a known place with a known reputation for maritime raiding and for being difficult to govern. They are the one group we can situate with real confidence. The Ekwesh have been connected to the Ahiawa, a power the Hittites corresponded with, which most scholars now identify with the Mycenaean Greek world, Ahiawa being plausibly related to the word Achaeans, the term Homer uses for the Greeks at Troy. If that chain holds, then Ekwesh may mean Mycenaean Greeks, which would be a striking thing to find fighting in Libya. But each link in that chain is an argument rather than a fact, and there is an added wrinkle. The Egyptian text describing the Ekwesh appears to refer to them as circumcised, which does not fit comfortably with what we would expect of Aegean Greeks. The Denyen have been linked to the Danaoi, another Homeric term for the Greeks, and also to a people called the Danuna, known from a Levantine context, and also, by some, to the biblical tribe of Dan. Three quite different proposals from one consonantal skeleton. The Weshesh are the most obscure of all. Suggestions have been made. A connection to the region of Wilusa, which many identify with Troy, is one, but honestly, we know almost nothing. The Chequer are associated with the coast of Canaan, and specifically with the town of Dor, where an Egyptian text from a century later describes them in control, running a harbor and behaving very much like an established local power rather than a wandering horde. And then there are the Peliset, who matter more than any of the others, because they are the one group whose later history we can trace on the ground. Peliset. Philistine. That identification is one of the more secure in the whole subject, and it opens a door into archaeology rather than speculation. Because in the 12th century BCE, along the southern coastal plain of Canaan, at Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza, something visibly changes. New pottery appears, locally made but in shapes and decorative styles that are recognizably derived from Aegean traditions rather than Canaanite ones. Not imported pottery, that is the crucial point. Locally produced, from local clay, in a foreign style, which means the people making it were there, not trading with somewhere else. Other changes come with it. New styles of building, including a type of hearth uncommon in earlier Canaanite architecture, loom weights of an unfamiliar shape, associated with a different way of weaving. And weaving is a deeply domestic, deeply traditional practice, the kind of thing that travels with households rather than with armies. Changes in diet, an increase in pig bones at some of these sites, in a region where pig consumption had been low. Different cooking vessels, implying different cooking. Taken together, that is not the signature of a conquering elite imposing itself on a population. Conquering elites tend to leave palaces and fortifications, and a change at the top. This is a change in kitchens and looms and dinner. It suggests families arriving and continuing to live the way they had lived somewhere else. Where somewhere else is, of course, the argument. The Aegean broadly. Cyprus, which was itself receiving Aegean influence, and may have been a staging post. Crete, which appears in some biblical traditions as the Philistine homeland. Western Anatolia. Some combination of all of them, arriving over several decades rather than in a single wave. And here is the part that most complicates the invasion story. Alongside the new material, a great deal of Canaanite culture continues. Local pottery keeps being made. Local deities keep being worshipped, and Philistine religion as we later encounter it looks substantially Levantine. Within a few generations, the inscriptions from these cities are in a Semitic language. Whatever arrived, it did not replace what was there. It merged with it. There is a deep and slightly unsettling thought sitting inside that, and it is worth letting it surface. We know these people as the Philistines primarily because of the Hebrew Bible, where they appear as the great antagonists: Goliath, Delilah, the enemy against whom Saul and David define themselves. The word Philistine survives in English as an insult, meaning someone hostile to culture and refinement. And the archaeology shows us people with fine painted pottery, monumental architecture, sophisticated metalwork, an organized urban society, and a written language. Whatever they were not that. Which tells you something about how the reputation of a people is made. It is made by their neighbors, and preserved by whichever of those neighbors happens to produce a text that survives. 3,000 years later, an entire population is remembered through a word used by the people who fought them, and the word has outlived every other thing about them. Hold that, because it is the thought that will carry us to the end of tonight. Now, before we leave the question of identity, I want to pull back and offer the honest position, which is more interesting than any single theory. There are broadly three ways historians have approached the Sea Peoples. The first, and the oldest, is the migration model, a great movement of peoples out of the Aegean and the central Mediterranean, pushed by drought or overpopulation or invasion from further north, rolling east and south, destroying everything in its path until Egypt stopped it. This was the standard account for a long time, and it has the advantage of matching the Egyptian texts fairly closely, since the Egyptian texts describe exactly that. The second is a more skeptical model, that the Sea Peoples were largely a symptom rather than a cause, that the collapse was driven by climate, internal decay, systems failure, and the breakdown of trade, and that the groups the Egyptians named were displaced populations, opportunists, and unemployed soldiers moving through a landscape that was already broken. On this reading, they did not knock the world down. They arrived in the rubble and were themselves among the people the rubble fell on. The third, which is where much of the current thinking sits, is that neither model works alone. There were real movements of people, and they had real consequences, and some cities really were attacked by seaborne forces. But those movements were themselves caused by the same pressures that were breaking everything else, and the relationship ran in both directions. Collapse producing migration, migration accelerating collapse, in a loop that no one inside it could see whole. And underneath all three is a question that is rarely asked directly. Were the Sea Peoples ever a they at all? Because there is no evidence that these groups thought of themselves as a single entity. There is no Sea Peoples empire, no king, no capital, no shared writing, no unified art. There is a list of names on Egyptian walls, and Egyptian scribes had every reason to lump foreign enemies together, because in the Egyptian world picture, foreignness itself was the category that mattered. It is entirely possible, and this is the reading I find most persuasive, though I hold it loosely, that what we are looking at is not one people, but a condition. A description of what happens to a large number of unrelated communities when the world stops working. A Lycian raiding crew that has always done this, and now finds nobody policing the sea. A village from the Aegean that has run out of food and put everything it owns on a boat. A group of professional soldiers whose king can no longer pay them, hiring themselves out and then, when the hiring dries up, taking what they need. A coastal town emptied by a raid whose survivors join the next group passing through, because there is nothing left where they were. And after a few years of that, on the road, at sea, fighting together and eating together and marrying each other's daughters, what were originally distinct communities would begin to become something new, not a nation, something more fluid, a company, a confederation, a moving population with a shared situation rather than a shared ancestry. Identity, when the homeland is gone, becomes something you build out of who is standing beside you. That may be why the names are so hard to pin down. We keep trying to find the place each name came from, as though every name were a return address. It may be that some of them were not places of origin at all, but names that formed on the move. Let us leave the theories now and go back to the ground, because there is a night I want to take you to. It is the most vivid moment in the entire collapse, and it happens in a city we have already stood in. Come back to the coast of Syria. Come back to Ugarit. Some decades have passed since we stood on the quay. The city is still standing. From a distance it looks much as it did, but things have changed in ways that would only be visible to someone who lived there. The last king of Ugarit is a man named Ammurapi. He is young, and he inherited a kingdom that was a vassal of the Hittite Empire, obliged to send tribute and troops and ships when the great king required them. And the great king has been requiring them. We know something of Ugarit's final period, because of what was found in the ruins. Tablets in the palace, tablets in private houses, some of them in an oven, where they had been placed to be baked and were never collected. That detail alone tells you how the end came. Someone put the day's correspondence into fire, in the ordinary way, expecting to take it out later. Let me tell you what those letters contain, and I will paraphrase them rather than quote, because the translations are disputed at points, and I do not want to put words into anyone's mouth that they may not have said. There is correspondence about grain, shipments, urgency, cargoes that must be released and sent on, a sense that food has become the central subject of diplomacy rather than a routine matter of logistics. There is correspondence about ships and men. The Hittite overlord requires Ugarit's fleet and Ugarit's troops, and they are sent to Lycia on the southern Anatolian coast, according to one reading, and to Hittite service elsewhere. Ugarit is a naval power, and its ships are away. And then there are the last letters. In one, the king of Alatia, Cyprus, appears to warn Ugarit that ships have been sighted and advises fortification and vigilance, asking where Ugarit's own forces are. In another, a reply attributed to Ammurapi says, in substance, that enemy ships have already come, that his cities have been burned, that they have done terrible things in the land, that his own troops are in Hittite territory, and his ships are away in Lycia, and that the land has been left, as he puts it, to itself. There is another letter, from a Hittite official, or from Ugarit's own administration depending on the reading, describing enemy ships in the vicinity, and instructing that lookouts be posted, that the population be assembled, that the enemy be reported. And there is a final, extraordinary document, one whose interpretation is debated, but which in the most common reading is a message from a man in the city, describing that enemy forces have arrived, that the situation is desperate, and asking whether he should stay or leave. Nobody answered any of them. The city burned. I want you to sit in that for a moment, because it is one of the strangest and most affecting things in ancient history. Warnings were sent. The system worked, right up to the end. Messengers traveled, letters were written. The correct officials were informed. The proper procedures were followed. A king in Cyprus wrote to a king in Syria to say that ships had been seen. A king in Syria wrote back to say they had already arrived and he had no fleet, because his fleet was where his overlord had sent it. Everything functioned except the part that was supposed to help. We might imagine the scribe in that room. He is not young. Scribes rarely were, given how long the training took. He has spent his life in the service of an archive, and he knows the correct formulae for addressing a great king and a lesser king and a merchant and a court. He is copying a message about ships, and he is aware, as he shapes each wedge into the clay, that he can smell smoke from somewhere in the lower town, and that the smoke does not smell like a cooking fire. He finishes the tablet. He does what he has always done with a finished tablet. He places it with the others, to be dried and fired. And then at some point he stands up and leaves, or he does not leave, and either way the room fills with something that is not ink. We do not know his name. We do not know if he got out. What we know is that the tablets baked in a fire nobody intended, and survived precisely because the building came down on top of them. That is the paradox at the heart of this whole subject. Almost everything we have about the collapse survives because of the collapse. The fire that destroyed the archive is the reason the archive exists. If Ugarit had simply declined slowly and been abandoned in an orderly way, the clay would have crumbled, and we would have nothing. We are reading a civilization by the light of the fire that killed it. Ugarit was never reoccupied. That is worth saying twice. This was one of the wealthiest ports in the Mediterranean, sitting on a superb harbor with excellent land around it, and after it burned, nobody rebuilt it. The site was left. It disappeared from memory so completely that when it was rediscovered in the 20th century, by a farmer whose plow struck a stone slab, nobody had any idea it was there. Now, an important caution. It is tempting to read those letters and conclude that we have found our culprits. Enemy ships, 7 of them in one reading, arriving and burning the city. But scholars have raised several difficulties. The order of the letters is not certain. Some may date from years before the end. The identity of the enemy ships is never specified. They are simply enemies. And there are arguments about whether Ugarit fell to a seaborne attack at all, or to a land force, or to some combination, or partly to an earthquake, since there is evidence of seismic damage at the site as well. What the letters give us is not the answer. What they give us is the texture of an ending, a state that could still write, still send, still request, and could no longer act. And Ugarit was not alone. Across the eastern Mediterranean, in a window of roughly 50 years, an extraordinary number of sites show destruction or abandonment. Not all at once, not all in the same way, but relentlessly. Go north from Ugarit and the coast of Syria and Cilicia shows the same pattern. Go inland, and the great inland center of Emmar on the Euphrates comes to an end, with its own final tablets speaking of hostile forces. Go up onto the Anatolian plateau, to Hattusa, and something even stranger has happened. The Hittite capital does show burning, but when archaeologists examined it closely, they found something unexpected. Before the fire, the city appears to have been emptied. The valuable objects were gone. The archives had been thinned, important tablets removed. The great storage jars were empty. Whatever burned at Hattusa burned after the people who mattered had already left, taking what they could carry. That does not look like a city stormed by raiders. It looks like an evacuation, which raises a question that is rarely asked. What does it mean for a capital to be abandoned? Where did they go? There are hints that the royal court may have relocated, that some Hittite authority persisted in the southeast for a time, but the empire, as an empire, simply stops. The correspondence ends. The great king, who wrote as brother to the Pharaoh of Egypt, vanishes from the record, and there is no obituary, no account of a final battle, no last stand. There is an empty city on a high plateau, and then silence. Now go west, across the Aegean, to the Greek mainland. The Mycenaean world in the 13th century is a landscape of palace kingdoms. Mycenae itself, with its lion gate and its shaft graves, Tiryns with walls so massive that later Greeks assumed giants had built them, Pylos in the southwest, Thebes, and others. Each palace administers its territory with the same kind of centralized record-keeping we saw in the Levant, in an early form of Greek written in a syllabic script we call Linear B. And in this same period, something goes badly wrong here too. There is a wave of destruction at the palace centers. There is also evidence of fear beforehand. Massive fortification walls being extended and strengthened, and at Mycenae and Tiryns, enormous engineering projects to secure water supplies inside the defenses, underground passages cut down to hidden springs. You do not build a secret stairway to water unless you are seriously contemplating a siege. At Pylos, which was not heavily fortified, the palace burned, and its Linear B tablets baked in the fire, and among them are records that have been read as showing coastal watchers being deployed, rowers being assigned, and administration attending to the sea. The exact meaning is debated. These are terse administrative documents, not narratives. But the impression of a state watching its coastline is difficult to shake. After the destructions, the palace system in Greece does not recover. And here comes the fact that always stops me. Writing stops. Linear B was a palace technology used by professional scribes for administrative purposes. When the palaces burned, the reason to write disappeared, and so did the training, and so did the script. Greece enters a period of several centuries with no written records at all. When Greeks write again, it is with an entirely different system, an alphabet borrowed from Phoenician traders, and the memory of Linear B is so completely gone that no ancient Greek ever knew it had existed. Think about what that means for the people who lived through it. Somewhere in the 12th century BCE, there was a last man who could read Linear B. He may have known it, he may not. Either way, when he died, an entire mode of recording human affairs went out of the world for 400 years. Population appears to fall sharply across much of Greece. Settlements shrink or are abandoned. Some communities move to more defensible ground, hilltops, islands, remote coastal positions. Others seem to leave altogether, and there is evidence of Aegean-connected populations turning up elsewhere, including on Cyprus and along the Levantine coast. Which brings the story around in a circle, does it not? Because if some of the people fleeing the collapse of the Mycenaean world crossed the sea and arrived on the coast of Canaan, then some of the sea peoples were themselves refugees from the very same catastrophe they are blamed for causing. Victims and agents, the same people, depending entirely on which shore you are standing on when you see their sails. Let the mainland go now, and let us drift out over the water to Cyprus, because Cyprus is the pivot of this whole world, and its story is the most ambiguous of all. The island is the copper source. Its ingots are in every harbor we have visited. Its ruler corresponds with the pharaoh as an equal. Its ports handle the traffic between the Aegean and the Levant, and it is prosperous in a way that is visible in its architecture and its metalwork. And in this period, Cypriot sites show destruction too, some burned, some abandoned. But Cyprus does something the mainland does not. It changes and continues. New settlements appear. Some existing centers are rebuilt. There is a visible increase in Aegean-style material culture, in architecture and in pottery, suggesting that people from the Aegean world arrived and stayed. Copper production carries on. The island reorganizes rather than dying. Cyprus, in other words, may be the clearest case we have of what actually happened to a great many places. Not extinction, but transformation under pressure, with newcomers and locals working out a way to share a coastline. Let us come down now from the level of kingdoms and stand for a while at the level of a single life, because I have been talking about systems for a long time, and systems are not what anybody actually experienced. We might imagine a merchant. He is in his 50s, based in a coastal town on the Levantine shore, and he has spent 30 years running a route he knows in his sleep. South with oil and wine, back with copper and finished goods, with stops at the same harbors, dealing with the same families, some of whom he has known since they were children. This year his ship is late. Ships are often late, weather happens, cargoes get delayed, harbor masters are difficult. He waits, and he does the sums, and he tells the men who work for him that it will come. It does not come. He never finds out what happened. That is the part we do not usually think about, that most people caught in a collapse never learn the story. There is no announcement. There is simply a ship that does not arrive, and then another one, and then a season in which no ships arrive at all. And slowly, a man who has been a merchant his entire adult life becomes a man who used to be a merchant. Or we might imagine a bronze smith, somewhere inland. His workshop has been in the family for 3 generations. He knows exactly how the metal behaves, how to judge a mix by color and sound, how long to keep a blade in the fire. His skill is total, and it is worth nothing at all, because there is no tin. Perhaps he begins by making less, then by repairing rather than making, then by melting down what already exists, old tools, broken fittings, a votive figurine, anything with metal in it, and recasting it, which is exactly what archaeologists find at some sites from this period. Hordes of scrap, gathered and waiting. And then perhaps, at some point, he puts down the tools that have defined his identity and goes to work in a field, because a field will feed him. Or we might imagine a family on a road, a woman with 2 small children and a cart with a broken axle that her husband is trying to fix while there is still light. In the cart, a grinding stone, because you cannot make flour without one. Seed, wrapped and guarded more carefully than anything else, because seed is next year. A cooking pot, a loom weight or 2, because cloth is money. A knife. Everything else was left, including things she had assumed she would die holding. They are not going anywhere in particular. They are going towards a rumor that there is grain in a town 3 days east, or that a lord on the coast is taking men and feeding their families. And here is the uncomfortable question the whole subject keeps circling. What is that family when they arrive? To themselves, they are survivors. They are people who did the responsible thing, who kept their children alive, who left a place that could no longer support them, and who are now asking for a chance to work. To the town they arrive at, a town which is also short of food, whose own stores are low, whose own people are frightened. They are a threat. 100 more mouths, then 1,000. Strangers, speaking differently, wanting land. And if that town refuses them, and they are hungry, and some of them are armed men who used to be soldiers, then the thing changes. Then a migration becomes a raid, not through anybody's grand design, but through the ordinary arithmetic of desperation meeting scarcity. And the people in the town, afterwards, will describe what happened to them accurately, that they were attacked by foreigners who came and took what they had. Both accounts are true. That is the horror of it. There is no version of this story in which someone is lying. We might imagine a soldier too. He was trained by a palace that no longer exists, and his skills are the only currency he has. He fights for whoever can feed him, a coastal lord this season, a different one next. And when nobody can pay, he and the men he trusts go and take what they need, and then they are pirates. And then a king somewhere hires them precisely because they are dangerous, and now they are royal troops again. Was he an invader? He would not have recognized the word. He was a man with a spear who wanted to eat, and we might imagine a king in a palace on a coast, reading reports. He knows the situation better than anyone. He knows the grain figures. He knows how many ships he actually has, and where they are. He knows which of his vassals have stopped sending tribute, and which of his neighbors have stopped answering letters. He has more information than any of his subjects, and it has brought him no power at all, because information without capacity is just a clearer view of the drop. We might imagine him giving orders that he already suspects will not be carried out. Posting watchmen, writing to an overlord who has not replied in months. Performing the rituals of a functioning state because the performance is itself a kind of load-bearing wall, and because the alternative, saying aloud that it is over, would bring the whole thing down before the ships even arrived. There is something in that which is not confined to the Bronze Age, and I will leave it exactly where it is. Now let us go back to Egypt one last time, because Egypt is the survivor, and the way it survived is the most quietly devastating part of the whole story. Ramesses III won. Whatever the true scale of the fighting, Egypt was not conquered. No foreign dynasty took the throne. The temples continued, the Nile continued, and the pharaoh carved his victory onto a wall where it can still be read 3,000 years later, and it made almost no difference. Because within a generation or two of that triumph, Egypt was visibly weaker. Central authority declined. The empire in Canaan, which Egypt had held for centuries through garrisons and vassal rulers, dissolved, not through a great defeat, but through a slow withdrawal, as the cost of holding it exceeded what it returned. Egyptian control in Nubia weakened, tomb robbery became endemic, and there are records of investigations and trials. There are documents recording grain price instability. There is evidence of internal conspiracy at the highest level, including a plot against Ramesses III himself within the palace. By the end of the dynasty, real power in the south had shifted substantially to the priesthood of Amun at Thebes, and Egypt would eventually split, with different authorities in the north and the south. The pharaoh had defended the border and lost the world. And there is a document from roughly 80 or 90 years after Ramesses III that shows you exactly what that felt like, and it is one of my favorite texts from the ancient world, because it is so ordinary and so humiliating. It is an Egyptian account of a man sent to the Levantine coast to buy timber for a sacred bark, cedar, from Lebanon, which Egypt had been obtaining from that coast for something like 2,000 years, generally as tribute or as a matter of course, and the journey is a disaster from beginning to end. He is robbed. He is delayed. When he reaches the coast, he is kept waiting for weeks by a local ruler who is entirely unimpressed by his credentials. He has trouble producing payment. He is lectured about the nature of the relationship between Egypt and the coast, and reminded, in effect, that timber is a commodity and Egypt is a customer now. Along the way he has dealings with the Checker, one of the sea people's names, who are running the port at Dor and who pursue him afterwards over a dispute, behaving like an established regional power with ships and interests of their own. The tone of the whole text is one of a man discovering, painfully and in public, that his country is not what it used to be. Whether the account is a real report or a literary composition is debated, but either way it captures something true, an Egyptian abroad, invoking the prestige of a great kingdom and finding that the prestige no longer buys what it once did. That is the real shape of Egypt's victory. It held the line and it kept its name, and the world in which that name had meant something had simply ceased to exist around it. There is something worth sitting with there. We tend to imagine that the survival of a state is the same thing as the survival of its position. It is not. A civilization can win every battle it fights and still lose the conditions that made it powerful. Because power is not only an army, it is a network, a set of relationships, a position within a working system. Destroy the system and the army is still there, standing in a field, victorious over nothing. Egypt did not fall in 1177 BCE, or in any year near it. Egypt would go on for another 1,000 years and more, through revivals and foreign dynasties, and eventual absorption into other empires. But the Egypt of the great correspondence, the Egypt that wrote as brother to the great king in Hattusa and traded across an entire sea, that Egypt ended in this period, and no monument records the ending, because the monuments only record the victory. So let us ask the question that all of this has been moving towards, now that we have walked the ground. Did the Sea Peoples destroy the Bronze Age world? I think the honest answer has three parts, and none of them is satisfying in the way a mystery story is satisfying. The first part is that they were real, and that in some places they did real damage. There are destruction layers. There are letters describing enemy ships. There are populations that arrive and settle where they were not before. Something happened, and it involved armed groups moving by sea, and it was not invented by Egyptian scribes. The second part is that they cannot have been the cause of the collapse, because the collapse is too big and too varied. It includes cities destroyed by earthquakes, cities abandoned without violence, cities that simply shrank. It includes a drought signal that begins before the destructions and lasts long after them. It includes internal rebellions, dynastic wars, an Assyrian empire pressing from the east, and the failure of a trade system that had been showing strain for decades. Hattusa was emptied, not stormed. Pylos burned, but it is a long way from the delta. No confederation of raiders, however large, arranges the simultaneous decline of half a dozen unconnected causes. And the third part is the one I find hardest to shake, that the sea peoples may have been the collapse, in the sense that they were what the collapse looked like when it took human form. Not an external force that arrived to break the world, but the world itself, broken, in motion. If your palace burns, you become a refugee. If you are a refugee for long enough, and you are armed, you may become a raider. If you raid successfully, another palace burns, and its people become refugees. The thing feeds itself. And to anyone watching from a city that had not yet fallen, that process would look exactly like an invasion by a mysterious foreign power, because from the walls, you cannot see where the ships came from, only that they are here, which is why the Egyptian description is not a lie. It is a view from a particular window. That thought leads somewhere I want to spend a little time, because it is the part of tonight that will still be useful to you long after the names have gone. Every society under strain reaches for a story about outsiders. It is one of the most consistent patterns in human history, and it is not simply cynicism or propaganda, though it often becomes those things. It answers a real need. When things are going wrong in ways that are diffuse and structural and slow, bad harvests, failing trade, rising prices, institutions that no longer deliver, the human mind struggles enormously to hold that as an explanation. It is unsatisfying. There is nobody to confront. There is no moment at which it can be said to have been solved. A foreign enemy is a far better story. It has a face. It arrives on a particular day. It can be fought, and crucially, it can be defeated, and the defeat can be carved on a wall. And in a world organized around the idea that the ruler's function is to hold back chaos, the story is not just convenient, it is the only story the system knows how to tell about itself. Ramesses could not carve a relief depicting a 30-year decline in rainfall. There is no image for a slow breakdown in the tin supply. There is a magnificent image for a pharaoh at the mouth of the Nile, arrows drawn, holding the line. So the wall shows the ships. And 3,000 years later, we read the wall, and we ask who the ships were, and we spend a century arguing about names, because the monument set the question, and the monument's question was never really about them at all. I want to be careful here. I am not saying the Egyptians made it up, or that there is something dishonest about the Medinet Habu account. I am saying something more interesting, that the surviving record is shaped by what its makers were capable of recording, and by what it was in their interest to record, and that both of those things filter reality before it ever reaches us. The people who fought at the Delta left no monuments. They may have had songs about it. They almost certainly had their own account of who they were and why they had come, and in that account, they were not chaos, and they were not a horde. They were, presumably, people trying to get somewhere. None of it survives, not one line. So we have a war described entirely by one side, and we have inherited that side's vocabulary so thoroughly that we still call the other party by a name that essentially means the ones who came from over there. That is worth remembering whenever you read about any conflict, ancient or otherwise. Ask who kept the records. Ask what they were for. Ask what a monument is designed to do, which is never simply to inform. And there is a final turn to this, which is the strangest of all. The Bronze Age collapse was catastrophic. Cities died, populations fell, writing was lost, art traditions ended, and a world of extraordinary interconnection contracted into something smaller and poorer and more local for several generations. That is not a thing to romanticize. But it was not the end of anything, except a particular arrangement. Out of that rubble came the world we actually inherited. Iron, for instance. The reason iron replaced bronze may have had a great deal to do with this collapse, because iron ore, unlike tin, is widely available, and once the long-distance networks that made bronze possible had broken, a metal you could dig up locally became enormously attractive. Ironworking was known before the collapse. It was not new. What changed was the incentive. A technology that had been marginal became central, not because someone invented it, but because the alternative stopped arriving. There is a lesson in there about how change actually happens, and it is not a flattering one for the way we usually tell it. The new thing does not always win by being better. Sometimes it wins because the old thing became impossible. The alphabet, too. Remember that early alphabetic script at Ugarit, that attempt to simplify writing? Complex scripts like Linear B and cuneiform required professional scribes, trained for years by institutions. When those institutions burned, the scripts went with them. What survived and spread in the centuries afterwards, along the Levantine coast, was alphabetic writing, a system simple enough to be learned by a merchant rather than a mandarin. And from that came the Phoenician alphabet, and from that the Greek, and from that the Latin, and from that, ultimately, the letters in which every word I have written tonight was set down. Writing did not suddenly become common. Literacy remained the property of a small minority for centuries afterwards, and it would be a very long time before anything resembling ordinary reading and writing existed anywhere. But the threshold had moved. A script of a few dozen signs can be learned in a season by a merchant who needs it, rather than over years by a boy handed to an institution. And that made writing something capable of living outside a palace. It happened, in part, because the palaces that had monopolized it were gone. The Phoenicians themselves are one of the great survivals. The Canaanite coastal cities that were not destroyed, or that recovered, Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, found themselves in a Mediterranean with no great powers left to control the sea lanes, and they filled the space. Within a few centuries they were trading the length of the Mediterranean, founding colonies, and carrying that alphabet everywhere they went. The vacuum did not stay empty. It never does. In the Anatolian highlands, the Hittite Empire was gone, but Hittite culture did not simply evaporate. In the southeast, a group of smaller successor states carried on for centuries, still using Luwian hieroglyphic writing, still calling themselves by versions of the old names, ruling from cities like Carchemish. An empire had become a scatter of principalities, and something of it survived in that reduced form for 400 years. In the highlands of Canaan, in the same period, small settlements began appearing in areas that had been thinly occupied. Modest villages, without palaces, without monumental architecture. Out of that landscape, over the following centuries, emerged the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and eventually a body of literature that would shape a great part of the world. And in Greece, after several centuries of contraction, the pieces reassembled into something entirely new, the polis, the city-state, with a form of politics that had no real precedent in the palace world. When the Greeks began to write again, one of the first things they wrote down was a story about a great war fought long ago across the sea by heroes from a vanished age of bronze, a memory of exactly the world that had ended, transmitted for 400 years by people who could no longer read, and who preserved it in verse because verse is what survives when archives do not. Homer is, in a sense, the Bronze Age remembering itself through a fog it could not see across. So the story does not end in ruin, it ends in transformation, but a transformation nobody chose, that nobody living through it could have recognized as anything other than loss, and that took a very long time. That is the shape of it, I think. Not civilization and its destruction, just civilization, doing what it has always done, forming, elaborating, overextending, breaking, and reforming into something its own ancestors would not have recognized. And now let us go back to the water. Let the arguments go. Let the names go. The Shurden, the Shekelesh, the Peliset, the Weshesh, all those consonants without vowels, all those centuries of careful and unresolved debate. You do not need to hold any of them. They have waited 3,000 years to be identified, and they can wait a little longer while you sleep. Come out instead to the edge of a coastline somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, on a night not long after all of this has finished happening. It is very dark, darker than any night you have experienced, because there is nothing on this coast that makes light except fire, and there are far fewer fires than there used to be. The sea is quiet. It moves against the rocks below in the same slow rhythm it has kept for 100,000 years, entirely unconcerned with any of it, with the palaces and the ingots and the letters and the ships, with which king wrote to which king, with whose army held which mouth of the river. The water has no memory of the Bronze Age. It never noticed that anything had changed. There is a harbor down there, or the place where a harbor used to be. The stone quay is still there, mostly, though a section of it has fallen in, and nobody has thought it worth repairing. The mooring posts stand at intervals along it, with nothing tied to them. No ships tonight. None tomorrow either. Up the slope behind it, the town is smaller than it was. Some of the houses are lived in, others are not, and their roof timbers have been taken for other purposes, because timber is valuable, and the dead have no use for it. Grass has come up between the paving stones in the upper streets. In the palace, where the archive was, the rooms are open to the sky, and there is nothing in them but fallen plaster and blackened beams and, beneath all of it, unread, unregarded, waiting, a great many tablets of clay. The people who live here now do not know what the marks on them mean. Nobody within 100 miles does. The letters are still there, still legible, still perfectly preserved. A king asking for grain, a merchant confirming a shipment, an official reporting ships on the horizon, and they will lie in the dark, saying exactly what they always said, for 3,000 years, until somebody who has not yet been born learns a language that has not yet been reconstructed, and reads them. Think of that for a moment as you drift. All that urgency, all that fear, preserved perfectly and unheard for 100 generations, and out on the sea, where the last light of the day has gone from the water, there is nothing at all. The ships have vanished, not sunk in a great battle, most of them, simply stopped. The men who sailed them are old somewhere, or dead, or farming a piece of land in a country they arrived at as strangers and now think of as home, in a language their grandchildren speak with a local accent. The great kings are gone, the one in Hattusa on his high plateau, who wrote as a brother to the pharaoh, the one in Ugarit who could not recall his own fleet, the lords of the palace kingdoms across the Aegean, with their painted floors and their careful inventories of chariot wheels and perfumed oil. The scribes are gone, with their years of training and their beautiful, obsolete competence. And the people we call the sea peoples have passed beyond the edge of recorded memory, which is not the same as having disappeared. Some of them are down there, in the villages along this coast, in the towns of the southern plain where their pottery is being made a little more roughly each generation, in shapes that are slowly forgetting the shapes they came from. In the harbor at Dor, where their descendants argue with an Egyptian official about the price of cedar. In the blood, and the habits and the recipes and the weaving patterns of populations who no longer remember arriving. They did not stop existing, they stopped being distinguishable. That is what usually happens. And so we come back to the question we began with, and I am going to leave it open, because the evidence will not close it, and I would rather give you an honest uncertainty than a tidy answer. Did they destroy the ancient world? Perhaps some of them destroyed some of it. Perhaps a fleet came out of the dark to a coastal town whose defenders were somewhere else, and took what was there, and burned the rest. And the people of that town would have said yes, without hesitation, and they would have been right. But the world they are said to have destroyed was already failing. The rain had been thin for a generation. The grain ships were already emergency measures. The tin was already unreliable. The empires were already fighting their own relatives for their own thrones. The web was already carrying more load on fewer strands than anybody had thought to count. And the people in those ships were, in all likelihood, running from the very same thing. So perhaps the truest way to put it is this: they were not the mysterious civilization that destroyed the ancient world. They were the ancient world, coming apart and moving. And they are remembered as destroyers for a reason that has nothing to do with what they did. They are remembered that way because the only people in that century who had the resources to carve their version of events into stone that would last 3,000 years were the kings who were frightened of them. History is not what happened. History is what was written down by whoever was still in a position to write, and whoever's writing happened to survive. The Sea Peoples lost that competition so completely that we do not even know what they called themselves. Let that settle now, and let it go soft, because there is one more thing, and then we will let the whole of it fade. The old world ended, and human life did not. The families kept moving. The seed grain in the cart was planted somewhere. The children in the wagons grew up and had children of their own, and those children were not refugees. They were locals, in a place their grandparents had arrived at with nothing. The bronzesmith's son learned to work iron, because iron was what there was, and he was better at it than his father would have believed possible. Villages became towns, towns became cities. The alphabet spread along the coast in the hands of ordinary traders. Somebody, somewhere, began to shape the memory of a great war across the water into lines of verse, so that it could be carried in the mouth rather than in an archive. And it was carried that way for 4 centuries, and it survived. Nothing that was really valuable was entirely lost. It was only reorganized, under new management, by people who had never seen a palace and did not miss one. That is the quiet thing underneath all of this, and it is why I wanted to tell you this story tonight, rather than a simpler one. They always do. The strongest and most confident arrangements, the ones that feel like the permanent shape of reality, the ones nobody can imagine the absence of, are structures built by particular people at a particular time, and they are held up by connections that are usually invisible until they are gone. And when they end, what survives is not the palace, it is the practice, the knowledge in the hands, the habit of making, the willingness to move, and to begin again somewhere unfamiliar, and to become, over a generation or two, someone new. Survival, in the end, did not belong to the strongest kingdom. Egypt was the strongest kingdom, and Egypt won its battle and lost its world. It belonged to the adaptable, to Cyprus, reorganizing, to the coastal traders who filled an empty sea, to the villages in the highlands that had never had far to fall, to the people in the carts. That is not a comfortable thought, and it is not meant to be a motivational one. It is just what the evidence looks like, if you sit with it long enough. And now let all of it grow distant. Let the harbor go dark. Let the fallen quay and the empty mooring posts, and the water moving quietly against the rocks below, drift back into the night, where they have been for 3,000 years. Let the palace go, the roofless rooms, the plaster, the beams, and beneath them the clay tablets with their small pressed wedges, patient, unread, holding their sentences in the dark. Let the great kings go, and their brotherly complaints about the quality of gold. Let the temple wall at Medinet Habu stand where it stands, in the dry heat of a valley far to the south, with its ships and its archers and its ox carts and its women and its children, carved into stone by men who wanted you to see only one thing, and who accidentally preserved something else entirely. Let the names go, one at a time, the way lights go out along a coastline. Shurdan, Shekelesh, Luka, Ekwesh, Teresh, Peleset, Cheka, Denyen, Weshesh, unpronounced, unplaced, unanswered. Let the sea keep them, and come back now, very slowly, through all of it. Up through the centuries, past the ruined palaces and the emptied cities, and the long silence where the writing stopped. Past Homer, singing about something he never saw. Past Athens and Rome, and everything that grew out of that broken web. All the way forward, through all the ages that had to happen before tonight. Back to this room. This bed, this weight of blanket, this particular ordinary safe darkness that you happen to be lying in. Feel how heavy your body has become. Feel the whole day's small tensions loosened out of your hands and your shoulders and your face, and the breath moving in and out without any help from you at all. There is nothing left to solve tonight. The mystery is 3,000 years old, and it has never once needed you awake. The ships have gone from the horizon. The fires have burned down to nothing. The harbors are quiet. The halls are empty. The tablets are sleeping in the dark under the fallen roofs. And you can let go now, completely. Sleep into power, guys. Good night.